Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce Tracy Sherrod to you from our Amistad imprint, who's going to introduce you to Jeffrey Colvin.
Thank you, Virginia. I think the greatest fantasy of all editors, and I think they tell you this every time they see you, right, that to be in a room with librarians is like we've died and gone to heaven. Thank you for everything. And so I'm pleased to introduce Jeffrey Colvin. Jeffrey was born and raised in Alabama and has spent 2 decades writing short fiction and essays that explore the African American experience in America. Before moving to New York, to enroll in an MFA program at Columbia, he served in the United States Marine Corps, worked as an advertising analyst, congressional aide, and nonprofit manager. He spent nearly 20 years on the research and writing of his debut novel, AFRICAVILLE, which he's here to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. And I'd also like to thank all of the staff here at HarperCollins. They've been very good at helping me prepare for the presentation. As she said, this is my debut novel, and really the first time I've entered into this. Writers are usually in a little cubby writing away and not out with such a huge audience. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for inviting me. To begin, one question I often get is, you are a young man from Alabama. How did you come to write a novel about Canada? One answer is, of course, that my novel, AFRICAVILLE, is about more than Canada. One of the things we like to say about it is AFRICAVILLE chronicles 3 generations of the Seaboat family: Kath Ella, her son Etienne, and his son Warner, as their lives unfold against the tumultuous events of the 20th century. It takes readers from Nova Scotia to Montreal to New England and down to the Deep South. Along the way, it explores notions of passing, cross-racial relationships, and the meaning of home. The novel also presents the tumultuous events in the birth, growth, maturity of a small Nova Scotia community. Since AFRICAVILLE is based on a real town, I did a lot of research, and I'm going to share just a little bit of that with you here today. I want to start with this picture of Alabama, which is this so-called Black Belt region of Alabama. It's a place that has, for one thing, a large proportion of Black residents. But this region is also the site of a number of, which you probably already know, civil rights marches and protests for voting rights in the 1960s. One of these marches is the Selma to Montgomery March of the 1965. That one's well known. The one on the right, however, caught my attention as well. It shows a group of people along the march. And seeing that photograph, I began to wonder about these people who live in the rural areas along the march from Selma to Montgomery. Did they participate? And if so, why? If they didn't participate, why didn't they? I happen to have a very close connection to rural Alabama. My grandmother raised a family in rural Alabama. When I left to go off to college, she moved away from the community. But when I came home on leave from the Marine Corps one summer, I learned that the community had been razed, torn down, and all the people gone. But subsequent to that, I listened to some of the stories the neighbors told about their former community. Some of their stories were happy stories, the people who dressed the best for church, the weddings that folks talked about for years, the small schoolhouse where the teacher's performance was more theater than lecture. Then there were stories about how the community ended. And these were difficult stories about the young men and women who could not find jobs once the mines had closed. In the late 1990s, I began to write a series of short stories about rural communities on the verge of extinction. But I did not see any of these stories as being part of a larger narrative until I read an article in the New York Times in 2001 about a small Nova Scotia community just north of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Okay. The town was called AFRICAVILLE, and it came into the news in the 1960s. It had been formed earlier than this, but it came to prominence in the news in the 1960s when, over the objection of the residents, the city of Halifax decided to bulldoze the community and move the residents out to make way for a bridge. Here you'll see a picture of the community, a picture of the people looking at the houses that are going to be demolished, and then finally you'll see a picture of the bridge that was there after the community was gone. I thought about this community for a while, and one of the things I thought about was the fact that the residents fought long and hard not to be removed from their community. And then for decades, they continued to fight the city for restitution for being moved. Now, I learned in 2010 that the mayor of Halifax actually did apologize to the citizens and their descendants of AFRICAVILLE for having destroyed the community. Yet and still, the residents continue to fight today for full amends for their homes having been destroyed. So I set aside the article, but I couldn't stop thinking about this community. I wondered about the people who had come up to Nova Scotia from the US and from the Caribbean, either by force to escape slavery, unaware of what was in store for them. I had also read that some of the people from the community had gone on to Sierra Leone, Africa. What happened to them? Most importantly, though, I thought about how vociferously the residents had protested being removed from their community. So even before I began to do research, I thought, this is a town that could definitely be the source of a novel. Now, I consulted numerous articles, books, and films about AFRICAVILLE. However, I thought that for a novel, I wanted to look at, none of them had explored how the pull of a town like AFRICAVILLE might affect several generations of one family. I also suspected that there were some deep connections between AFRICAVILLE and the story of those small rural communities I was writing about in Alabama. I wanted my fictional village to have the same sounds and smells of AFRICAVILLE, and I wanted it to be filled with the same rich characters. But for that, I needed to do a little bit more research about how they had come to Canada. A question for the audience. How many of you know about the New York Times series called 1619? I'm sure you probably all do. It's about, it commemorates the arrival of the first enslaved Africans onto the shores of America. Well, the arrival of blacks in Canada also begins in the 1600s. The man on the left there, little is known about him, but his name is Matthew de Costa. That's what he sort of goes by. And he arrived in Canada in the 1600s. You see two pictures of an artist's rendering of him. The man on the right also arrived in Canada around 1600. His name is Lejeune, and he was captured in Madagascar as a boy and brought to Canada around 1628. Now, those were the earliest arrivals in Canada. The 1700s, though, was the time in which a large influx of people began to come to Canada. And the woman in the middle is an example of that. Her name is Chloe Cooley, and she lived in Ontario. And her attempt to escape from her captor in the late 1700s led to the first anti-slavery law in Canada. In writing about Canada, my community had three main sources. And this mirrored somewhat the people who lived in the actual village of AFRICAVILLE. So in AFRICAVILLE, we have people came up to Canada as a result of war, the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. They also came up in the Underground Railroad, and then a large group came up from Jamaica, the so-called Jamaican Maroons. The first settlers that came up in and around the Revolutionary War came up with the white loyalists who did not support America's desire to leave Britain. And so they brought their slaves with them. A lot of them settled in the province of Quebec, in that area, and but a lot of them also went to Nova Scotia. So this group became part of my village of AFRICAVILLE. Okay. But the largest number of blacks came to Canada during the War of 1812. Now, during the Revolutionary War, there were a number of proclamations issued by military leaders and also governors telling slaves, free your captors, join with us, and then we'll take you off to freedom. These occurred during the Revolutionary War, but the most prominent proclamation was issued during the War of 1812. You'll see that there on the left. I'll read you a little portion of the proclamation. All persons who may be disposed to migrate from the United States will, with their families, be received on board of His Majesty's ships or vessels of war or at the military posts. They will have their choice of either entering into His Majesty's sea or land forces or of being sent as free settlers to the British possessions in North America or the West Indies, where they will meet with due encouragement. Given under my hand at Bermuda this 2nd day of April 1814 by command of Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane. The picture on the right is the man who left Maryland during this period, around the War of 1812. He and several thousand other blacks turned out to be part of the largest group emancipation of blacks prior to the Civil War. Some of these immigrants landed in Halifax and also became part of the village of AFRICAVILLE. The second group that came up with the Underground Railroad. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, so I'll touch on it briefly. By the estimates of how many people came up to Canada on the Underground Railroad vary, but between 80 and 100,000 is one figure that's thrown around a lot. Of these, about a third went on to Canada. Again, most of them settled in the Quebec, Ontario area, but some of them did wind up in Nova Scotia, and thus those people also became a part of the fictional community of AFRICAVILLE. Okay. And finally, the largest group of immigrants that made up the fictional village of AFRICAVILLE arrived in July of 1796. 3 ships, the Dover, the Mary, and the Anne, landed in Halifax Harbor carrying approximately 600 men, women, and children. They came from the tropical highlands of Trelawney, Jamaica. Now, they had lived there as a community of freed blacks. In Jamaica, some of the blacks, ran off from their plantations, and the British allowed them to live in these small communities. There were a number of them in Jamaica. This was one called the Trelawney Jamaicans. Well, in the previous year, 1795, the governor of Jamaica decided that the Trelawney Maroons were plotting an insurrection. And so they were rounded up, placed on a ship, and shipped off to Halifax. So the interesting thing about this group of immigrants is that out of this group came the matriarch of the Seaboat family, one of the main family of my novel. So, and I wonder about her a lot. Kath Ella was her name. She was an immigrant. She was a descendant of the immigrants from Jamaica. What was she like? What were her hopes and fears, all those things? And with whom did she have a child to start the next generation? in thinking about the man with whom Cathella had a child, I could have used people who came up with the Underground Railroad, people who came up during the wars, and also people who came up over on the ships with the Jamaicans. But I decided to move with another little-known fact about blacks moving to Canada. And that is, in the early 1900s, a number of blacks came into Canada, not around Halifax, but way up in Cape Breton. And these blacks came up to Canada principally to work in the mines. And most of them came from the West Indies, but a few did come from the southern United States. And thus, that man, a descendant of those immigrants, is the person with whom Cathella had a son, Etienne. The next question was what was her relationship to this community, Cathella, And also, what about the subsequent generations? What was their relationship to this mythical village called Africaville? The short answer is Cathella moved with her son Etienne to Montreal. Her son Etienne later moves to Vermont and then to Alabama, where his son Warner is born. Now, I knew what might pull these generations to Africaville: its unique history, the continued efforts by the former residents to keep the community alive, but what would cause the subsequent generations to distance themselves from Africaville? Okay. Okay, that's the slide of the, okay. This shows you a little bit of how difficult it was to work in the coal mines of Cape Breton. And this slide also shows one of the communities up in Cape Breton. Glass Bay was one of the areas where some of the residents lived. Okay. And so the question becomes, what might cause some of the subsequent generations to distance themselves from Africaville? One of the issues is Cathella moves to Montreal. Her son and her grandson wound up in the South. Etienne, her son, the second generation, uses his ability to pass to distance himself from Africaville. Now, passing, obviously, as you all know, is when someone light enough, a black person, a person considered black by society, is light enough to be considered white, and they decide to pass as such. So Cathella's son, Etienne, decides to pass for white. This decision leads to a lot of internal turmoil, and that's one of the conflicts of the story, his story. Etienne's son, Warner, learns that he has a black grandmother later in life, and he attempts to try to reconnect with some of the relatives and the residents of Africaville, and that becomes one of the central conflicts of his story. So the story of the three generations of the Seabold family, that is the flesh and blood of the novel. Its spine is the dramatic tale of the beginning, maturity, ending, and in some ways the transcendence of the village of Africaville. I'll close by reading. I'll give you all a sneak preview of one of the things we're considering for, let me talk about this first. Nella Larson's, one of the covers for Nella Larson's book was this picture by a African-American artist called Palmer Hayden. And one of the things that struck me about the picture is, you can see here, there's a woman standing here looking out. And I sort of read it as she's afraid that the other black woman in the picture might see her and out her as passing for white. As you know, this could be very dangerous in the 20s and 30s for people. It could lead to them being ostracized at best, and even bodily harm at worst. And so, in looking at the picture, I began to I could almost feel the terror that the woman has of being outed as a black person. So I'll close by giving you a sneak peek, you heard it here first, of one of the quotes that we may use for the epigraph for Africaville. And it says, There is no moral distance between the facts of life in San Francisco and the facts of life in Birmingham. For this quote, it might be said that Baldwin is looking from Alabama west toward California. My novel began with me looking from Alabama north toward Nova Scotia. But I believe Baldwin and I came to the same conclusion, that we are all strongly connected. That in my writing a novel about Canada, I was also writing a novel that was also very close to home. Thank you.